So I'm personally very excited about this panel. Our last panel of the day, a panel comprised of representatives from donor institutions, as well as others who are closely working with donors. I will introduce our fabulous moderator first, but let me actually ask our panelists to come to the stage. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Ritu Sharma, who then I'll turn it over to, and she'll introduce our panelists. Ritu Sharma is the president of Sharma Solutions, where she provides consulting services for strategy, advocacy, training and coaching, and gender analysis. In 1998, Ritu founded Women Thrive Worldwide, a nonprofit that puts the concerns of the poorest women and girls at the center of U.S. international assistance. Women Thrive's advocacy was instrumental in the creation of the White House strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally, as well as USAID's establishment of the Gender Equality and Female Empowerment Policy. Ritu, thank you again for moderating this panel, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So, it's the panel you've all been waiting for. It's the money panel with the donors. Yay! And it's thinned out in here, and so also all of the donors here are taking note of who stayed, because really, you're the ones who care about gender, right? So, thank you for sticking around. So what we want to do during this panel is really explore, and I sort of jokingly said the money panel, but the reality is that doing good gender integration does require money. And it's often the hardest thing to get into a project budget, and if it's in a project budget, to keep it in the project budget. So we're going to explore that issue and some of the challenges around that with the donors up here. Each of our colleague guests are going to introduce themselves just to save a little bit of time as we move along. And as they introduce themselves, they're also going to say a little bit about how their institution has prioritized gender. So, Susan, we are going to begin with you.
Great. Thank you so much. I am Susan Markham. I am the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Female Empowerment at USAID. And I've been there about over a year. If you were here last year, you saw my first public speech, which was a little off topic.
Awesome.
It was awesome / off the charts.
It was awesome.
They haven't let me speak publicly for a year now, this time.
Right.
But so the work that we do every day at USAID, not just myself, but a whole host of gender champs who work across the agency in DC and the missions, is really to fulfill USAID's mission to end extreme poverty and support and build strong, resilient democratic societies. And so using the gender policy that was enacted 3 years ago, we use measurements and the goals within that to measure our progress and try to help the agency do a better job taking the issues of women and girls and men and boys into account, but also helping our implementing partners help us do that work across the world.
Great. Well, we want to hear a lot more about that. Theo, please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Theo Sowa, and I'm with the African Women's Development Fund. And AWDF is the first and only, really, African women's foundation which supports African women's rights organizations across the continent. It was founded by 3 really visionary African women, one from Uganda, one from Nigeria, one from Ghana, who'd been working both in regional, national, but also in international organizations for much of their careers and had kept hearing the mantra that we all talk about women being the engine for change and women driving development, etc. But every time they looked at where the money went, it did not go to women's rights organizations. So instead of complaining about it, they decided to set up an organization to focus on getting human and financial resources to African women's organizations to really drive that change. So that's what we do.
Great, and I dare say that even now that women and girls are all the rage, there's still remarkably little funding going to women's rights organizations.
It's truly frustrating. AWID, the Association of Women's Rights and Development, did some research a while ago which looked at the money that was going. They looked at 740 women's rights organizations across the world, and the median income was $20,000 US. And in that same year, the annual income for Save the Children International was something like $1.4 billion. So women's rights organizations still, to this day, despite all the rhetoric about investing in women, investing in girls, are not getting the financial resources. So how are people expecting that change to be driven?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that. Great. Joan.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm less of a donor, I just want to make this clear. But I have sat in your seats. I'm currently the special advisor for the Women's Empowerment Principles, Equality Means Business, abbreviated WEPS, because everything has an abbreviation, which is a partnership initiative of UN Women and the UN Global Compact, and was launched in 2010. On the priority side, I don't have to integrate gender, because actually at UN Women it's sort of vision, mission, and priority. So we already come as a package. But I'll say that for the Women's Empowerment Principles, we've turned priority to a strategy, because what the principles try to do primarily for the private sector is for companies to make women's equality their priority. And I think that's kind of where we try to turn the tide a bit.
Great, thank you, Joan. Appreciate your being here. And Sally, who is still on London time.
Yeah, she just said you're next. I think worried that I was about to fall asleep. So. I'm Sally Gear. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I work for the UK's Department for International Development. My current role is team leader for a team on sustainable energy, but I've also been given very recently a sort of a gender champion role in the Climate and Environment Department, so, and particularly around sustainable energy, which is an area we very much need to up our game in women and girls. It's not so obvious perhaps as other sectors here. Prior to that, I've spent 15 years working on girls' education, leading the UK government's Girls' Education Challenge, so I know some people through that role. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Sally. Andrew.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Morrison. In 30 seconds or less, what do you need to know about me? I'm a recovering academic. It's a 12-step process.
I think you're on step 11, though. You're pretty well
I'm pretty well recovered. I'm a Ph.D. economist. Those first two things mean I have very high nerd potential. I've been working on gender equality issues for well over 20 years. Currently, I'm the chief of the Gender and Diversity Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank has a gender policy which commits the institution to doing three things. One is the famous M word, the mainstreaming gender across all the bank does. I'm pleased that over the last 4 years we've quadrupled the percent of projects in the bank which seriously work on gender. We've still got a long way to go. The second thing we do is work on projects which directly promote gender equality or women's economic empowerment. We've got a couple of flagship projects that I may talk about a little bit about later on. And the third thing we do, we're the only multilateral development bank that has a gender safeguard, which commits us to doing no harm to gender equality through our projects. It's still very much a work in progress, but we've tried to identify particular sectors where there may be risks to gender equality inherent in the projects and try and not fall into those risks. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And Emily.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and also a privilege to be having this conversation alongside such experts on this topic. I coordinate the OECD Development Assistance Committee's network on gender equality, which is better known as the GenderNet. And this brings together the gender advisors from development agencies and ministries of foreign affairs of the 29 DAC countries, so basically the big bilaterals and the small ones. And we work closely with observers from the World Bank, regional development banks, UN and civil society, so really very many of you on this panel. Our priority in recent years has been supporting donors' efforts to influence global processes to advance gender equality, particularly the post-2015 framework. And now we're increasingly turning our attention to ensuring that this is underpinned by an ambitious financing framework to ensure that those commitments translate into action.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate those of you being here from so far away and for such a short time as well. I want to get into this question of how do we really get gender to move in these institutions? And all of you are really in the role of being a champion for gender in an institution that, to varying degrees, is ready to take it up and doing it, or to varying degrees has resistance. And based on your experience, what do you think is that linchpin that really gets gender moving throughout an agency from top to bottom? And by that, I mean, is it incentive funds? Is it required gender policy like the Inter-American Development Bank has? USAID's policy is, it's not optional, I would say. It's something between optional and binding, but it is not a requirement, right?
Yes.
But you don't get
It's
the
strongly
money.
suggested.
It's strongly suggested. That's what it is. If you want the money, you'll do this. So
Yes.
you'll do it, right? So, but all the gender policies of these varying institutions are very, very different. And again, I don't believe DFIDs is a requirement.
Well, it is now.
Oh, it is now.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I mean, I think the Gender Equality Act is what stands out now in the UK government, because it was made law in 2014. So from that moment on, all our development assistance, including humanitarian aid, there's a requirement that proportionately, but
Right.
gender equality, we must promote gender equality in whatever we do. So that's created a very, and we can come on to talk about this a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a compliance approach, and some people may agree or disagree with that. But it's certainly created a very different incentive structure within the organisation and within non-traditional sectors that may not, particularly the one I'm now working in, that may not have looked at this issue before.
So forcing it could be part of that linchpin. But yeah.
But I have to say, whether it is required or suggested or whatever adjective you'd like to use, I think making it real is a different aspect. And just like in many of the places that we work, we try to pass laws, but that's really just, we think it's the hardest step, but really it's just the first step in a long path. And so we actually are working at USAID mirroring the way we look at the programs we do overseas. So if you think we work at the individual, the institutional, and the attitude levels, when we're working in countries to increase the decision-making of women and girls, we also are working that way at USAID. So we work with individual people. Gender 101, an online course, is mandatory for all staff engaged in the program cycle. So building the capacity of all staff, increasing the capacity of those who are the gender advisors. Then changing the institution through ADS 205 by creating materials and tools on how to do it, strengthening the institution as a whole, and then that top level is the attitudes, actually helping the staff understand how it makes our programs better and sustainable, so that and it's not just another policy, but they're bought into it. And so I think we're trying to mirror what we've used as the theoretical framework in our work inside to advocate and make the institution more responsive to the policy.
If
And
I
that-
could come
that
in just
makes a
real
lot of
quickly
sense,
on
yeah.
that, because at Inter-American Development, we shamelessly copied something that DFID did a few years ago. And I agree with what Susan said about attitudes and about giving people knowledge. But monetary incentives and relative prices matter too. And DFID gave staff bonuses that did good performance on integrating gender into their work. The Inter-American Development Bank has integrated it into our personnel review process. So if you're a manager, you're a division chief, you get better pay increases if you pay attention to gender. And frankly, it's made a difference.
We don't do that anymore.
I know. I don't think we're going to do it. You said you would do it for a finite period. I think in IDB we're going to do it for a finite period. I don't think it. I think it helps to solidify changed mindsets.
Right. Great. Emily?
I mean, just one more good example actually also from DFID. I mean, I think for me the linchpins are both leadership and accountability. And I think what DFID's done very well is it's positioned gender equality as part of the core results corporate framework. So there's 9 indicators, or was, in DFID's corporate results framework that all parts of DFID, including country offices or divisions, have to report on, and that is mandatory. And they've also positioned accountability at the highest possible levels of the organisation. So you've got someone on the management board, you've got the directors of the divisions having to report on what they've done on gender equality. I think that's been very powerful when it's come from the top.
One of the projects I just finished was a review for UN Women looking at all the gender policies of all the bilateral, multilateral donors, the private foundations, as well as looking for gender policies in civil society. And one of the really striking things is that civil society organizations tend not to have a gender strategy or gender policy or any requirements. And I think for us in this room that are the gender advocates within our institutions, it's something to seriously think about. That should your own institution have a gender policy or strategy? Should it have accountability built in? It's not just something we should be asking the donors to do, but it's something that all of us in civil society should be doing as well. I want to come back to this question of, so if it's all about gender equality and women, why is it that we're not seeing the level of support that we need for local indigenous women's organizations? We're beginning to see the big institutions partner with women's civil society, but as Susan knows, it's hard and it's slow and it's a bit like pushing a rock up a hill. I mean, Theo, and I invite you to be really blunt because...
Don't do that.
No, I do. Because we're not going to push ourselves forward in this conversation unless we're really willing to be honest about that. I will protect you personally.
I'm good at boxing.
Good. Okay. Good. I can't offer you much there. So, but. What do you think the problem is? Why is it that we haven't seen this flood of funding into indigenous groups, but we have seen a flood of funding into women's business associations and women's entrepreneurship programs? And, the funding is going to certain places. So what do you think about all of that?
Okay, I think that there are multiple reasons for this. I think that some of it is about people's perceptions of women and people's perceptions of women's rights, and that there's a fear about women's rights which doesn't exist in the same way when people are looking at women as instruments for reaching other things. So people talk about investing in women and girls, and they're kind of comfortable saying, okay, we'll invest in women as entrepreneurs. Now, African women, for example, are incredibly entrepreneurial. Otherwise, our continent would not have survived for this length of time with the number of challenges. But it's not every girl who wants to run her own business. And if we have all African women running small and medium-sized businesses, where do we find our scientists? Where do we find our chemical engineers? Where do we find, a whole range of people? But I think people are more comfortable with that idea of economic security than they are about rights and about saying that all women have a range of rights that are economic, that are social, that are cultural, that are political. So I think very often it's easier for people to put women into a box, whichever box they choose. It can be entrepreneurs, it can be health, it can be anything else. But I think an equally important reason is that we have had this narrative about women from the South, and I'm going to be talking about African women in particular because that's, the continent that I know best. But there's this one story, and the story is that African women are victims. And people don't invest in victims. People don't ask victims for ideas. People don't say, actually, you are a person of agency. You have kept a family together, a community together, a nation together in the face of incredible challenges. And so as long as we have that one narrative, which is so wrong and so dehumanizing and so undignified, then people hesitate to say, okay, let me really talk to African women activists and get a different viewpoint, and then put money into those organizations to strengthen the ability of those organizations to deliver.
Yeah.
And part of that goes through, it is not just donor organizations, and I'm sorry to say this to you, but there are many international NGOs who operate on exactly the same basis, because they talk about partnership, but where are the real decision makers in those organizations? Who are the people that they are accountable to? And when your accountability is hundreds of thousands of miles away from where your programming is, very often you make very different decisions. And so we need to change all of that. And some of those things do come back to the funding. We need donor organizations to stop having double standards about what they ask women's rights organizations to do and what they ask other people to do, the levels of evidence that are needed, the hoops that people are made to jump through for tiny amounts of money. And part of that, again, I think is that, you know, women's work has been underpaid or unpaid or undervalued for years. And so people almost assume that women will take on these challenges, take on these issues and do it almost as a volunteer. And if you say, no, we want to professionalize something, people start asking questions and they think, oh, well, maybe they shouldn't be doing that. So I think our perceptions of power and need to go beyond just saying, what are the power relationships between men and women? Yeah. We have to look at institutional power, organizational power, and we have to own where we actually add to the problem, even when we say we're trying to turn that problem around.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think you're preaching to the choir, and it is. I mean, it's interesting. The show of people in this room is a manifestation of institutional power. USAID said you will integrate gender in every bid, and if we don't think you did it good enough, we're not going to give you contracts. Look at all the people here. I mean, it is a manifestation of we all are getting on the ball now about gender. We've got to learn about it. We've got to build our capacity in it. So, Susan, you wanted to say something in response.
No, I just said she wasn't blunt at all. I think she was speaking truth to power, and so I think it's something that we talk about, we reference, but finding out how to actually change those dynamics we continue to struggle with. And so it can't be said enough or bluntly enough.
From the perspective, Joan, do you want to?
Well, I did want to add something there because, well, I love this discussion, of course, but the discussions about power and power relationships, you know, have been going on since the founding of UNIFEM and at the first World Conference on Women. It is really nice to hear them surface because for a long time there was an enormous pushback on feminists to deal with this power equation which fuels inequality, you know, at every level. But very specifically on your funding thing in organizations, there was a discussion, a very heated discussion years ago about gender mainstreaming because the issue, the context for us working sort of on gender equality at that point of women's human rights was we saw this as theoretically a very interesting idea. But in reality, the people charged with carrying it out, whether they were focal points at OECD or you didn't have any, were always either double tasked, you wear two hats, now you're the gender focal point. Doesn't matter if you know anything, you're the gender focal point. And you work at a level that is so incredibly low in hierarchical organizations that really only respect leadership, that it was a way of siphoning off money from women's rights organizations who I think sort of brought us to the dance at Beijing and set the agenda. And then we went into this sort of bureaucratic trying to understand, trying to make it programmatic. And that has taken, I think, a terrific toll on women's rights organizations, you know, in the developing world. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think we need to learn, we need to keep these lessons out front as we go into the SDGs and as we think that we are reinventing anything, we're probably not. But there are lessons from Beijing plus 20, and I'm not sure we're making the most of the knowledge that's probably in the room about these things. So I just wanted to add that.
Let's talk a little bit about the SDGs. So we've got this SDG Goal 5 on women, which is on gender equality, which is very robust. It's got all kinds of things in it. We don't know if that's going to survive the negotiating process. It may not come out the other end. And we even have sexual and reproductive health and rights in there, which is a deal breaker for many of the nations at the table. So do you think the Sustainable Development Goals, as they may come out the other end in September, do you think we can look to those as a gender community to be a galvanizing force, to be kind of set a standard on what we all should be doing on gender? Or should we not be so much focused on those SDGs? What do you all think about that?
I'd just like to just follow up a little bit on this.
Absolutely.
And I'll get on to that. Sure. Because I really hear what you're saying, and I'm interested in Susan and Andrew's view on this, because you're right, there is an ideological issue going on here as well, completely take that. I think there's also an institutional structure, process, incentive issue, which is around, it's very, very hard for us to give small grants to organisations now. And I don't quite know what's happened, but we are in a world where, the incentives are to give big amounts of money, ideally to one organisation, and because that's less transaction costs. Because in the UK, for example, which is great, we protect the 0.7, we've got a very relatively large aid budget, but at the same time we have a lot less staff to operationalise it. So the incentives are there. So I think we need to think about that as well. It's a political issue, but there's also a very real sort of administrative, I don't know how to say it, or a different incentive structure. And it concerns me, because so often I'll see great organisations will come and you'll have a meeting with them and you think, if only I could give them, nothing compared to the big grants, but what a difference that would make. And I feel quite powerless and able to do that. So, if anyone's got...
I think
I've got an idea.
that is the nut. Like, that is the nut that we have to crack to do development right. That's no small thing. Yeah.
I want to come in on this, and I want to say something which may not be very popular, but I will promise to be truthful as well. I sit in a development bank. And I don't think it's the international financial institutions' jobs to hand out small grants. It doesn't play to our strengths at all. Our clients are governments, and we need to, primarily are governments, and I think charitable foundations, perhaps bilaterals, but I can't speak for bilaterals, may have, certainly charitable foundations, have a much bigger comparative advantage in working with civil society. I think we owe, in the multilaterals, we owe incredible debts to civil society, because the fact that gender issues are as prominent as they are today in the region I work in, the Americas, is due to women's organizations on the ground. The fact that the Americas have, up until several months ago, had the only regional human rights convention on violence against women is due to women's rights organizations. But the Inter-American Development Bank is not the right place to be handing out small grants to women's rights organizations, in my opinion.
Sorry.
Theo, please.
Okay, and you don't have to. I mean, I actually agree with you. I think sitting really far away and trying to give grants to small women's rights organizations that you don't know and cultures that you don't understand doesn't work. But there are people who do understand those cultures, and you can make those bigger grants to those. But that's also not happening. So on the African continent at the moment, we have a whole range of African foundations whose primary aim has been around reaching and working with small and medium-sized organizations. And those organizations have got very sophisticated financial systems, policy, frameworks, etc., and can do that really effectively. So I don't think that people have to say, well, I'm going to sit in DC and make a $5,000 grant in rural Rwanda. You're right, that won't work. But there is something about taking on the challenge of saying, okay, we are going to work in real partnership. We are going to find those people who we can work with and say, we want to make 200 grants of X amount over this period of time in this area of work, and then trust those organizations to do the work and monitor the work and come back to you, because it does work, and we've got great examples of when that works.
So the mechanisms are there. Emily, you wanted to get
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I think there's two ways that bilateral donors can get around this issue of the administrative burden. So one is by funding women's funds, who are there because they can absorb large amounts of money and they've got great links to the grassroots. Exactly. So I would like to see many more bilaterals funding women's funds. And then the second is the example of the MDG3 and the Flow Fund that the Dutch government have been such leaders on. And I think this has been a very effective model where they've been able to have
Can you say a little bit more about it for those that are not familiar?
So the Dutch government launched a fund called the MDG3 Fund, and this did enable large amounts of money to go from the Dutch government to women's organisations. Some of it went directly to women's organisations in the south, and some of it went via women's funds. And it's been very effective at actually reaching the grassroots. There's been a number of evaluations done now of the impact of that fund, and it's shown the difference that that money's made. So I think for me, this shows that actually it is perfectly possible for bilaterals to support this kind of work. It's about the mechanisms and the kind of intermediary partners they might need to bring in on that. So I think moving forward, we really need to see with the SDGs a fund like that, but not just with the Dutch government. I think we need to see a number of governments coming on board together and funding that kind of work.
Great. So I think we've solved this problem, right? Women's rights organizations need the funding. There are great intermediary organizations who have the capacity to accept the funds, and you will now give them the funds. Great. So let's move on to the SDGs. Do any of you want to share your perspective on the SDGs? Do you think they'll be important for us in the gender field, or a sort of a ho-hum?
Well, I think there's something that happens before they're agreed, which is the financing for development conference, which is coming out. And so I think if people, in this room and elsewhere, I mean, certainly we're, as the UK government, really pushing for a good settlement on gender equality in that process. And that is about, ensuring across the piece there's, secured funding, because there's been a gap, as everyone knows. When you look at the MDGs, I think there was predicted 30 billion gap in 2007, and now it looks like it's 80 billion, and so it's just got higher. So that's a real issue, but also the issue around data and monitoring where money's going. So we know, and I know you can say more about that, Emily, because the OECD is very active in that, but so we actually know across sector that money is going where it should go. So I think that's the first, that's the first step in this big year we've got ahead to focus on.
Great.
I wish that the SDGs were ho-hum. I wish that we had made enough progress through the MDGs that here we are at 2015, and we didn't need to fight so hard and be so thankful for both a standalone goal and the integration across the others. But so it's not ho-hum, because we did have to fight. And as much progress as we've made, I also feel like sometimes we're playing defense and trying to prevent backsliding. And so, whereas I think the first set of goals drove, donors and organizations. I mean, it didn't start with them, but it organized us in some way to move ahead. I think the SDGs are an important tool to keep us moving in the right direction.
I would come in on that and say that I think I'm encouraged by the fact the SDGs as they currently stand, and Ritu, along with your comment to be politically correct about this, the fat person hasn't sung yet, right? That's the
politically correct version of what you're saying.
Not the fat lady, the person.
The fat person hasn't sung. So I was politically incorrect in terms of obesity, but anyway. But I think it's encouraging that there are elements in the SDGs that weren't in the MDGs, which are crucially important. I think the fact that leadership is explicitly there. I think the fact that violence is explicitly there. And we're all aware, everyone in this room is aware of the risk, is that the list is too long, and the list of indicators is too long. And I think one of the nice things about the MDGs is that the small number of indicators and goals allowed us to focus resources and focus attention. That's the risk of the long list we face now in terms of SDGs.
Yeah.
Can I just come in
Please.
On the financing issue that Sally raised? Because I think one thing that makes me feel optimistic about the SDGs is we have seen that MDG 3, for all its many shortcomings, which we're all familiar with, did help to galvanise a significant increase in aid in support of gender equality, which has actually more than tripled over the course of the MDGs. The problem is that, not surprisingly, it's primarily gone to the areas of girls' education and some aspects of women's health, because those are the priorities set by the MDGs. And we found major financing gaps in many of the areas that were omitted from the MDGs, like women's economic rights, like aspects of sexual and reproductive rights. So I'm optimistic that this time around, with a much more comprehensive agenda that does include many of the elements that were omitted from the MDGs, we could find that this plays a powerful role in closing some of the financing gaps that we need to close. So I think that there is reason to be optimistic, but it does depend very much on what we can agree in July in the conference on financing, and that does need to be ambitious.
And you know, I think that I want to agree and disagree with you about the MDGs and the SDGs. I think part of the success of the MDGs was about the failure of people to implement MDG 3. Yeah. And the recognition after a while that because people were not looking at issues of gender equality and women's rights, we were failing on a whole range of other MDGs. And in recognizing that, even though it was a little bit late, I think people then began to think, okay, how do we readdress this? So when it came to the SDGs, it was almost like being a victim of some level of success, that people were sort of like, oh yeah, women's rights, they're there, you know, gender equality, yeah, we've, you know, been there, done that, you know. And so it was almost taking it for granted. And in taking it for granted, we almost missed out on the goal as well as the integration across the variety of goals. And that's a real danger still, that, you know, come July and September, people still might be saying, oh, you know what, everybody understands about gender equality. We don't need something special on it. So it's about how do we build on the success of making people talk about women's empowerment, gender equality, and investments in so much of what we do, but actually get people to move from the talking into the actual practice. What do we change in order to make this real? So I agree with you, and my fear is that if we don't get it right, we'll find what we found with the MDGs, that we miss out on a whole range of improvements because we still don't make the changes that are needed in terms of really embedding the rights agenda.
Do anyone else want to add anything else on the SDGs?
I'll add just one quick note about, I think, the weakness in the MDGs and the need to disaggregate success. Because the MDGs hide as much as they showcase. And it is really, really important at this stage that the resources are used in as targeted a way as you can, so that the capital city, which may be doing very well on girls' primary and even secondary education, but the rural area is not getting it, that's not really captured very well in anything. And it, you know, whether it's poverty in China or anywhere else, we need to really look carefully at how to disaggregate how we're making progress and be sure that we're actually candidly reporting on where all those gaps will be. We sort of know where they'll be.
For me, one of the promising things about the SDG conversation so far is its focus on inequalities and inclusivity. And so I think there's a little ray of hope there. So I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. For all of the people in this room, all development professionals, all looking to partner with your various agencies, they're all trying to interpret what you want on gender. Right? What do you mean by gender? What do you want on gender? What do you mean by gender analysis? Do you mean just male and females, or do you really mean all genders? You know, all those kinds of questions that we have. Can you give everyone some guidance from the point of view of your institution of what you're looking for, or at least where to go to find what you're looking for?
Well, we have included in your packet. Because, well, what we found is that we were creating a lot of materials internal to USAID to give our staff guidance.
Right.
And I thought, you know, this is great for the couple thousand people at USAID. How about we share it with everybody? And so Gender 101 is now publicly available, and these how-to notes that have been created within the agency to instruct gender advisors and other folks working on gender assessments, they're now publicly available as well. And so we're hoping to share as much as we can and continue to move other materials that we've created internally on the internet and available to others. Because for those of us who are gender champs, we like when we are held accountable and all of our colleagues are held to the same standard. So we will continue to try to move in that way. One other aspect is that we have found that, I'm sure no one in this room, but other organizations will hire gender advisors